Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Anarchist audio library. Today we are going to be reading the second part of Aimé Césaire's essay, Discourse on Colonialism. We are going to be picking up where we left off, and it begins, "To go further, I make no secret of my opinion that at the present time the barbarism of Western Europe has reached an incredibly high level, being only surpassed, far surpassed, it is true, by the barbarism of the United States. And I am not talking about Hitler or the prison guard or the adventurer, but about the quote-unquote decent fellow across the way, not about the member of the SS or the gangster, but about the respectable bourgeoisie. In a time gone by, Leon Bloy innocently became indignant over the fact that swindlers, perjurers, forgers, thieves, and procurers were given the responsibility of, quote, bringing to the Indies the example of Christian virtues, unquote. We've made progress. Today it is the possessor of the quote-unquote Christian virtues who intrigues, with no small success, for the honor of administering overseas territories according to the methods of forgers and torturers. A sign that cruelty, mendacity, baseness, and corruption have sunk deep into the soul of the European bourgeoisie. I repeat that I am not talking about Hitler or the SS or pogroms or summary executions, but about a reaction caught unawares, a reflex permitted, a piece of cynicism tolerated. And if evidence is wanted, I could mention a scene of cannibalistic hysteria that I have been privileged to witness in the French National Assembly. By Jove, my dear colleagues, as they say, I take off my hat to you. A cannibal's hat, of course. Think of it, 90,000 dead in Madagascar, Indochina trampled underfoot, crushed to bits, assassinated, tortures brought back from the depths of the Middle Ages. And what a spectacle! The delicious shudder that roused the dozing deputies, the wild uproar. Bidot, looking like a communion wafer dipped in shit, unctuous and sanctimonious cannibalism, Moutet, the cannibalism of shady deals and sonorous nonsense, Costefleuret, the cannibalism of an unlicked bear cub, a blundering fool. Unforgettable gentlemen, with fine phrases as cold and solemn as a mummy's wrappings, they tie up the Madagascan. With a few conventional words, they stab him for you. The time it takes to wet your whistle, they disembowel him for you. Fine work. Not a drop of blood will be wasted. The ones who drink it straight to the last drop. The ones like Ramadier who smear their faces with it in the manner of Silenus. Fontlup Esperaber, who starches his mustache with it, the walrus mustache of an ancient Gaul. Old Desjardins, bending over the emanations from the vat and intoxicating himself with them as with new wine. Violence, the violence of the weak, a significant thing. It is not the head of a civilization that begins to rot first. It is the heart. I admit that as far as the health of Europe and civilization is concerned, these cries of kill, kill, and let's see some blood belched forth by trembling old men and virtuous young men educated by the Jesuit fathers make a much more disagreeable impression on me than the most sensational bank holdups that occur in Paris. And that, mind you, is by no means an exception. On the contrary, bourgeoisie schweinishness is the rule. We've been on its trail for a century. We listen for it. We take it by surprise. We sniff it out. We follow it, lose it, find it again, shadow it. And every day it is more nauseatingly exposed. Oh, the racism of these gentlemen does not bother me. I do not become indignant over it. I merely examine it. I note it, and that is all. I am almost grateful to it for expressing itself openly and appearing in broad daylight as a sign. A sign that the intrepid class which once stormed the Bastille is now hamstrung. A sign that it feels itself to be mortal. A sign that it feels itself to be a corpse. And when the corpse starts to babble, you get this sort of thing. Quote, "There was only too much truth in this first impulse of the Europeans who, in the century of Columbus, refused to recognize as their fellow men the degraded inhabitants of the New World. One cannot gaze upon the savage for an instant without reading the anathema written, I do not say upon his soul alone, but even on the external form of his body." Unquote. and it's signed Joseph de Maistre. That's what is ground out by the mystical mill. And then you get this, quote, "From a selectionist point of view, I would look upon it as unfortunate if there should be a very great numerical expansion of the yellow and black elements, which would be difficult to eliminate. However, if the society of the future is organized on a dualistic basis with a ruling class, dolichocephalic blondes, and a class of inferior race confined to the roughest labor, it is possible that this latter role would fall to the yellow and black elements. In this case, moreover, they would not be an inconvenience for the dolichocephalic blondes, but an advantage. It must not be forgotten that slavery is no more abnormal than the domestication of the horse or the ox. It is therefore possible that it may reappear in the future in one form or another. It is probably even inevitable that this will happen if the simplistic solution does not come about instead, that of a single superior race leveled out by selection. That's what is ground out by the scientific mill, and it's signed Lapouge." And you also get this from the literary mill this time. Quote, "I know that I must believe myself superior to the poor bayas of the Mambere. I know that I must take pride in my blood. When a superior man ceases to believe himself superior, he actually ceases to be superior. When a superior race ceases to believe itself a chosen race, it actually ceases to be a chosen race." And it's signed Sikari, Soldier of Africa. Translated into newspaper jargon, and you get Fageur. Quote, "The barbarian is of the same race, after all, as the Roman and the Greek. He is a cousin. The yellow man, the black man, is not our cousin at all. Here there is a real difference, a real distance, and a very great one, an ethnological distance. After all, civilization has never yet been made except by whites. If Europe becomes yellow, there will certainly be a regression, a new period of darkness and confusion. That is, another Middle Ages." Unquote. And then lower, always lower, to the bottom of the pit, lower than the shovel can go, M. Jules Romain of the Académie Française and the Revue des Deux Mondes. It doesn't matter, of course, that M. Farragut changes his name once again and here calls himself Salsette for the sake of convenience. The essential thing is that M. Jules Romain goes so far as to write this. Quote, "I'm willing to carry on a discussion only with people who agree to pose the following hypothesis. A France that had on its metropolitan soil 10 million blacks, 5 or 6 million of them in the valley of the Garonne. Would our valiant populations of the Southwest never have been touched by race prejudice? Would there not have been the slightest apprehension if the question had arisen of turning all powers over to these N-words, the sons of slaves? I once had opposite me a row of some 20 pure blacks. I will not even censure our N-words and N-word S's for chewing gum. I will only note that this movement has the effect of emphasizing the jaws, and that the associations which come to mind evoke the equatorial forest, rather than the procession of the Panathenia the black race has not yet produced, will never produce an Einstein, a Stravinsky, a Gershwin." Unquote. One idiotic comparison for another, since the prophet of the Revue des Deux Mondes and other places invites us to draw parallels between, quote, "widely separated," unquote, things, may I be permitted, N-word that I am, to think, no one being master of his free associations, that his voice has less in common with the rustling of the oak of Dodona, or even the vibrations of the cauldron than with the braying of a Missouri ass. Once again, I systematically defend our old N-word civilizations. They were courteous civilizations. So the real problem, you say, is to return to them. No, I repeat, we are not men for whom it is a question of, quote, "either or," unquote. For us, the problem is not to make a utopian and sterile attempt to repeat the past, but to go beyond. It is not a dead society that we want to revive. We leave that to those who go in for exoticism. Nor is it the present colonial society that we wish to prolong, the most putrid carrion that ever rotted under the sun. It is a new society that we must create, with the help of all our brother slaves, a society rich with all the productive power of modern times, warm with all the fraternity of olden days. For some examples showing that this is possible, we can look to the Soviet Union. But let us return to M. Jules Romain. One cannot say that the petty bourgeoisie has never read anything. On the contrary, he has read everything, devoured everything. Only his brain functions after the fashion of certain elementary types of digestive systems. It filters, and the filter lets through only what can nourish the thick skin of the bourgeoisie's clear conscience. Before the arrival of the French in their country, the Vietnamese were people of an old culture, exquisite and refined. To recall this fact upsets the digestion of the Banque d'Indochine. Start the forgetting machine. These Madagascans who are being tortured today less than a century ago were poets, artists, administrators? Shh, keep your lips buttoned, and silence falls. Silence as deep as a safe. Fortunately, there are still the N-words. Ah, the N-words. Let's talk about the N-words. All right, let's talk about them. About the Sudanese empires, about the bronzes of Benin, Shango sculpture. That's all right with me. It will give us a change from all this sensationally bad art that adorns so many European capitals. About African music, why not? And about what the first explorers said, what they saw, not those who feed at the company mangers, but the Delbis, the Marchais, the Pigafettas, and then Frobenius. Say, you know who he was, Frobenius. And we read together, quote, civilized to the marrow of their bones, the idea of the barbaric N-word is a European invention, unquote. The petty bourgeoisie doesn't want to hear anymore. With a twitch of his ears, he flicks the idea away. The idea, an annoying fly. Therefore, comrade, you will hold as enemies, loftily, lucidly, consistently, not only sadistic governors and greedy bankers, not only prefects who torture and colonists who flog, not only corrupt, check-licking politicians and subservient judges, but likewise, and for the same reason, venomous journalists, goitrous academics, wreathed in dollars and stupidity, ethnographers who go in for metaphysics, presumptuous Belgian theologians, chattering intellectuals born stinking out of the thigh of Nietzsche. The paternalists, the embracers, the corrupters, the backslappers, the lovers of exoticism, the dividers, the agrarian sociologists, the hoodwinkers, the hoaxers, the hot air artists, the humbugs, and in general, all those who, performing their functions in the sordid division of labor for the defense of Western bourgeoisie society, try in diverse ways and by infamous diversions to split up the forces of progress. Even if it means denying the very possibility of progress, all of them tools of capitalism, all of them openly or secretly supporters of plundering colonialism, all of them responsible, all hateful, all slave traders, all henceforth answerable for the violence of revolutionary action. And sweep out all the obscurers, all the inventors of subterfuges, the charlatans and tricksters, the dealers in gobbledygook, and do not seek to know whether personally these gentlemen are in good or bad faith, whether personally they have good or bad intentions, whether personally, that is, in the private conscience of Peter or Paul, they are or are not colonialists, because the essential thing is that their highly problematical subjective good faith is entirely irrelevant to the objective social implications of the evil work they perform as watchdogs of colonialism. And in this connection, I cite as examples, purposely taken from very different disciplines. From Gouraud, his book Les Pays Tropicaux, in which, amid certain correct observations, there is expressed the fundamental thesis, biased and unacceptable, that there has never been a great tropical civilization, that great civilizations have existed only in temperate climates, that in every tropical country the germ of civilization comes and can only come from some other place outside the tropics, and that if the tropical countries are not under the biological curse of the racists, there at least hangs over them with the same consequences a no less effective geographical curse. From the Reverend Temple's missionary and Belgian, his, quote, Bantu philosophy, unquote, as slimy and fetid as one could wish, but discovered very opportunely as Hinduism was discovered by others in order to counteract the, quote, communistic materialism, unquote, which it seems threatens to turn the N-words into, quote-unquote, moral vagabonds. from the historians or novelists of civilization. It's the same thing. Not from this one or that one, but from all of them, or almost all. Their false objectivity, their chauvinism, their sly racism, their depraved passion for refusing to acknowledge any merit in the non-white races, especially the black-skinned races, their obsession with monopolizing all glory for their own race. From the psychologists, sociologists, et al., their views on quote-unquote primitivism, their rigged investigations, their self-serving generalizations, their tangentious speculations, their insistence on the marginal, quote-unquote separate character of the non-whites, and although each of these gentlemen, in order to impugn on higher authority the weakness of primitive thought, claims that his own is based on the firmest rationalism, their barbaric repudiation for the sake of the cause of Descartes' statement, the charter of universalism, that, quote, reason is found whole and entire in each man, and that, where individuals of the same species are concerned, there may be degrees in respect of their accidental qualities, but not in respect of their forms or natures, unquote. But let us not go too quickly. It is worthwhile to follow a few of these gentlemen. I shall not dwell upon the case of the historians, neither the historians of colonization nor the Egyptologists. The case of the former is too obvious, and as for the latter, the mechanism by which they delude their readers has been definitively taken apart by Sheikh Anta Diop in his book, Nations, Négres et Culture, the most daring book yet written by an N-word, and one which will without question play an important part in the awakening of Africa. Let us rather go back to M. Gouraud, to be exact. Need I say that it is from a lofty height that the eminent scholar surveys the native populations which, quote, have taken no part, unquote, in the development of modern science, and that it is not from the effort of these populations, from their liberating struggle, from their concrete fight for life, freedom, and culture that he expects the salvation of the tropical countries to come, but from the good colonizer, since the law states categorically that, quote, it is cultural elements developed in non-tropical regions which are ensuring and will ensure the progress of the tropical regions toward a larger population and a higher civilization, unquote. I have said that M. Gouraud's book contains some correct observations. The tropical environment and the indigenous societies, he writes, drawing up the balance sheet on colonization, have suffered from the introduction of techniques that are ill-adapted to them, from corvées, porter service, forced labor, slavery, from the transplanting of workers from one region to another, sudden changes in the biological environment, and special new conditions that are less favorable. A fine record, the look on the university rector's face, the look on the cabinet minister's face when he reads that. Our Gouraud has slipped his leash, now we're in for it, he's going to tell everything, he's beginning, quote, the typical hot countries find themselves faced with the following dilemma: economic stagnation and protection of the natives, or temporary economic development and regression of the natives. Monsieur Gouraud, this is very serious. I'm giving you a solemn warning. In this game, it is your career which is at stake. And so our Gouraud chooses to back off and refrain from specifying that if the dilemma exists, it exists only within the framework of the existing regime. That if this paradox constitutes an iron law, it is only the iron law of colonialist capitalism, therefore of a society that is not only perishable, but already in the process of perishing. What impure and worldly geography! If there is anything better, it is the reverend temples. Let them plunder and torture in the Congo. Let the Belgian colonizer seize all the natural resources. Let him stamp out all freedom. Let him crush all pride. Let him go in peace. The Reverend Father Temples consents to all that, but take care, you are going to the Congo. Respect, I do not say native property. The great Belgian companies might take that as a dig at them. I do not say the freedom of the natives. The Belgian colonists might think that was subversive talk. I do not say the Congolese nation. The Belgian government might take it much amiss. I say, you are going to the Congo. Respect the Bantu philosophy. It would be really outrageous, writes the Reverend Temples, if the white educator were to insist on destroying the black man's own particular human spirit, which is the only reality that prevents us from considering him as an inferior being. It would be a crime against humanity on the part of the colonizer to emancipate the primitive races from that which is valid, from that which constitutes a kernel of truth in their traditional thought, etc." Unquote. What generosity, Father, and what zeal! Now then, know that Bantu thought is essentially ontological, that Bantu ontology is based on the truly fundamental notions of a life force and a hierarchy of life forces, and that for the Bantu, the ontological order which defines the world comes from God, and as a divine decree must be respected. Wonderful. Everybody gains, the big companies, the colonists, the government, everybody except the Bantu, naturally. Since Bantu thought is ontological, the Bantu only ask for satisfaction of an ontological nature. Decent wages, comfortable housing, food. These Bantu are pure spirits, I tell you. Quote, "What they desire first of all and above all is not the improvement of their economic or material situation, but the white man's recognition of and respect for their dignity as men, their full human value." Unquote. In short, you tip your hat to the Bantu life force, you give a wink to the immortal Bantu soul. And that's all it costs you. You have to admit you're getting off cheap. As for the government, why should it complain? Since the Reverend Temples notes with obvious satisfaction, quote, "From their first contact with the white men, the Bantu considered us from the only point of view that was possible to them, the point of view of their Bantu philosophy, and integrated us into their hierarchy of life forces at a very high level." Unquote. In other words, arrange it so that the white man, and particularly the Belgian, and even more particularly Albert or Leopold, takes his place at the head of the hierarchy of Bantu life forces, and you have done the trick. You will have brought this miracle to pass. The Bantu God will take responsibility for the Belgian colonialist order, and any Bantu who dares to raise his hand against it will be guilty of sacrilege. As for M. Manoni, in view of his book and his observations on the Madagascan soul, he deserves to be taken very seriously. Follow him step by step through the ins and outs of his little conjuring tricks, and he will prove to you as clear as day that colonization is based on psychology, that there are in this world groups of men who, for unknown reasons, suffer from what must be called a dependency complex, that these groups are psychologically made for dependence, that they need dependence, that they crave it, ask for it, demand it, that this is the case with most of the colonized peoples and with the Madagascans in particular. Away with racism, away with colonialism, they smack too much of barbarism. M. Manoni has something better, psychoanalysis. Embellished with existentialism, it gives astonishing results. The most down-at-the-heel cliches are resold for you and made good as new. The most absurd prejudices are explained and justified, and as if by magic the moon is turned into green cheese. But listen to him. Quote, "It is the destiny of the Occidental to face the obligation laid down by the commandment, 'Thou shalt leave thy father and thy mother.' This obligation is incomprehensible to the Madagascan. At a given time in his development, every European discovers in himself the desire to break the bonds of dependency, to become the equal of his father. The Madagascan never. He does not experience rivalry with the paternal authority, manly protest, or Adlerian inferiority, ordeals through which the European must pass and which are like civilized forms of the initiation rites by which one achieves manhood." Unquote. Don't let the subtleties of vocabulary, the new terminology frighten you. You know the old refrain. Quote, "The N-words are big children," unquote. They take it, they dress it up for you, tangle it up for you. The result is Manoni. Once again, be reassured, at the start of the journey it may seem a bit difficult, but once you get there, you'll see you will find all your baggage again. Nothing will be missing, not even the famous white man's burden. Therefore, give ear. Through these ordeals, reserved for the Occidental, one triumphs over the infantile fear of abandonment and acquires freedom and autonomy, which are the most precious possessions and also the burdens of the Occidental. And the Madagascan, you ask? A lying race of bondsmen, Kipling would say. M. Manoni makes his diagnosis. Quote, "The Madagascan does not even try to imagine such a situation of abandonment. He desires neither personal autonomy nor free responsibility." Unquote. Come on, you know how it is. These N-words can't even imagine what freedom is. They don't want it. They don't demand it. It's the white agitators who put that into their heads. And if you gave it to them, they wouldn't know what to do with it. If you point out to M. Manoni that the Madagascans have nevertheless revolted several times since the French occupation, and again recently, in 1947, M. Manoni, faithful to his premises, will explain to you that is purely neurotic behavior, a collective madness, a running amok, that, moreover, in this case, it was not a question of the Madagascans setting out to conquer real objectives, but an, quote, imaginary security, unquote, which obviously implies that the oppression of which they complain is an imaginary oppression. So clearly, so insanely imaginary, that one might even speak of monstrous ingratitude, according to the classic example of the Fijian who burns the drying shed of the captain who has cured him of his wounds. If you criticize the colonialism that drives the most peaceable populations to despair, M. Manoni will explain to you that after all, the ones responsible are not the colonialist whites, but the colonized Madagascans. Damn it all, they took the whites for gods and expected of them everything one expects of the divinity. If you think the treatment applied to the Madagascan neurosis was a trifle rough, M. Manoni, who has an answer for everything, will prove to you that the famous brutalities people talk about have been very greatly exaggerated, that it is all neurotic fabrication, that the tortures were imaginary tortures applied by, quote, imaginary executioners, unquote. As for the French government, it showed itself singularly moderate, since it was content to arrest the Madagascan deputies, when it should have sacrificed them if it had wanted to respect the laws of a healthy psychology. I am not exaggerating. It is M. Manoni speaking. Quote, treading very classical paths, these Madagascans transformed their saints into martyrs, their saviors into scapegoats. They wanted to wash their imaginary sins in the blood of their own gods. They were prepared, even at this price, or rather, only at this price, to reverse their attitude once more. One feature of this dependent psychology would seem to be that, since no one can serve two masters, one of the two should be sacrificed to the other. The most agitated of the colonialists in Tananarive had a confused understanding of the essence of this psychology of sacrifice, and they demanded their victims. They besieged the High Commissioner's office, assuring him that if they were granted the blood of a few innocents, quote, everyone would be satisfied, unquote. This attitude, disgraceful from a human point of view, was based on what was, on the whole, a fairly accurate perception of the emotional disturbances that the population of the high plateau was going through, unquote. Obviously, it is only a step from this to absolving the bloodthirsty colonialists. M. Manoni's quote-unquote psychology is as disinterested, as free, as M. Goreau's geography or the Reverend Temple's missionary theology. And the striking thing they all have in common is the persistent bourgeoisie attempt to reduce the most human problems to comfortable, hollow notions. The idea of the dependency complex in Manoni, the ontological idea in the Reverend Temples, the idea of, quote, tropicality, unquote, in Goreau. What has become of the Banque d'Indochine and all that? And the Banque de Madagascar? And the bullwhip, and the taxes, and the handful of rice to the Madagascan or the Nyak? And the martyrs, and the innocent people murdered, and the blood-stained money piling up in your coffers, gentlemen. They have evaporated, disappeared, intermingled, become unrecognizable in the realm of pale rationalizations. But there is one unfortunate thing for these gentlemen. It is that their bourgeoisie masters are less and less responsive to a tricky argument, and are condemned increasingly to turn away from them and applaud others who are less subtle and more brutal. That is precisely what gives M. Yves Floren a chance. And indeed here, neatly arranged on the tray of the newspaper Le Monde, are his little offers of service. No possible surprises, completely guaranteed with proven efficacy, fully tested with conclusive results. Here we have a form of racism, a French racism, still not very sturdy, it is true, but promising. Listen to the man himself. Our reader, a teacher who has had the audacity to contradict the irascible M. Floren, contemplating two young half-breed girls, her pupils, has a sense of pride at the feeling that there is a growing measure of integration with our French family. Would her response be the same if she saw in reverse France being integrated into the black family, or the yellow, or red? It makes no difference. That is to say, becoming diluted, disappearing, unquote. It is clear that for M. Yves Floren, it is blood that makes France, and the foundations of the nation are biological. Quote, its people, its genius, are made of a 1,000-year-old equilibrium that is at the same time vigorous and delicate, and certain alarming disturbances of this equilibrium coincide with the massive and often dangerous infusion of foreign blood which it has had to undergo over the last 30 years. Unquote. In short, crossbreeding, that is the enemy. No more social crises, no more economic crises. All that is left are racial crises. Of course, humanism loses none of its prestige. We are in the Western world, but let us understand each other. Quote, it is not by losing itself in the human universe with its blood and its spirit that France will be universal. It is by remaining itself, unquote. That is what the French bourgeoisie has come to 5 years after the defeat of Hitler, and it is precisely in that its historic punishment lies, to be condemned, returning to it as though driven by a vice to chew over Hitler's vomit. Because after all, Aimé Césaire was still fussing over peasant novels, quote, dramas of the land, unquote, and stories of the evil eye, when with a far more evil eye than the rustic hero of some tale of witchcraft, Hitler was announcing, quote, the supreme goal of the people state is to preserve the original elements of the race, which by spreading culture create the beauty and dignity of a superior humanity, unquote. Aimé Césaire is aware of this direct dissent, and he is far from being embarrassed by it. Fine, that's his right, as it is not our right to be indignant about it. Because after all, we must resign ourselves to the inevitable and say to ourselves once and for all that the bourgeoisie is condemned to become every day more snarling, more openly ferocious, more shameless, more summarily barbarous, that it is an implacable law that every decadent class finds itself turned into a receptacle into which there flow all the dirty waters of history, that it is a universal law that, before it disappears, every class must first disgrace itself completely on all fronts, and that it is with their heads buried in the dunghill that dying societies utter their swan songs. Thank you for reading along with me. This has been part 2 of Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism.